Good afternoon. Welcome to our conversation on one of America's most challenging migration route, the Darien Gap on Colombian-Panamanian border. This event is co-sponsored by four centers: Duke University Center for Global and International Studies, Center for International Development, Center for Latin America and Caribbean Studies, as well as Center for Documentary Studies. My name is Piotr Plewa. I conduct research on international migration. I also teach, but also from time to time, I engage in treasure hunt. And today I would like to present you to two treasures. I found Bruno Federico and Nadja Drost, the two independent journalists from New York City, originally from Canada and Italy, but now based in New York City, who have done a fascinating work following migrants through the Darien Gap, the narrow swath of jungle that links South America with Central America. Bruno and Nadja have a very rich history of reporting. They have reported for a number of outlets, most notably for PBS NewsHour. They were based in Colombia for over 10 years, so they are very familiar with the region. And the documentary that we will discuss today, they made thanks to the support of Pulitzer Center. So chapeau to Pulitzer Center, as well as PBS NewsHour. Thank you so much for making it possible for them to make this wonderful documentary we will discuss very shortly. Perhaps not to prolong any further, let me pass the podium to my colleague, Professor Miguel Rojas-Sotelo, who is an expert in Colombia and Panama. He's coming from the region himself and spent some time in the Darien region that we will talk about today. Miguel, could you just give us a brief context of the area that we will talk about today?
Thank you, Piotr. Thank you for the opportunity and welcome to our guests. I had the opportunity to travel to this region and also to work with cultural producers from El Darien, this border region. The place is home to at least 15 indigenous communities from three major families: the Embera, the Waonan, and the Gunadule, also known as Kunas, in addition to many Afro-Palenque communities that for more than 300 years had established free communities in the deep of the jungle and at the side of some of its many rivers. Then the Darien Gap is not really empty. As a matter of fact, it is from this, abandoned place and region of the continent where the term Abya Yala has emerged. And this is a very important term. Why? Because indigenous intellectuals in the early 1990s got together to rename a continent, America, that obliterated their histories and ways of life. The Darien is at the heart of the continent. It connects the continent, as a matter of fact, from north and south. The linguistic expression Abya Yala literally means, and I quote, land that bleeds, end quote. And it arises from the Gunadule peoples of the Urabá and the Darien as an ancestral reference to the American territory. As one of my collaborators, Rocha Vivas, points out, at present, the term has assumed different meanings and according to geocultural context of the continent. For example, the Aymara leader from Bolivia, Takir Mamani, assumes the notion of Abya Yala as land in full maturity, in opposition to the idea that America is a no man's land, and this region in particular is a no man's land, proposed from the early colonial points of view. On the other hand, Armando Muyolema, an important professor from the Quichua of Ecuador, working in the US, suggests that Abya Yala is also an epistemological and social form alternative to Western civilization. Finally, the linguistic reading proposed by Gunadule, a Kuna scholar, Abadio Green, says from its etymological entrails that the meaning of Abya is, and I quote, bird, the blood bone of the earth. And at the same time, Abya refers to the blood of the confrontations on the continent because of the European invasion, and end quote. Hence, this term, Abya from the Darien Gap, will be alive and is also bloody, is capable of absorbing the history of the conquest and the new colonialisms on top of this territory, but also the cultural resistances across the continent. Perhaps you have seen some of this art that is right now behind me. These are known as the molas. These are written female practices that are at the core of the gunadule, that underline their relationality with the forest, with the plants and the other beings, the non-human beings. But they are also forms of subsistence and cultural affirmation in the Darien Gap and beyond. And I think this is a good context to bring our guests today, Nadja and Federico, that will introduce us to their piece, What Migrants Face as They Journey Through the Deadly Darien Gap, and then open a dialogue. And I want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us at Wednesdays at the Center, Global Anti-Racism's Histories of Action. And I will leave it like that.
Thank you very much. Let me just give you a very, very brief context in the current times. And then, since picture is worth 1,000 of words, I would suggest that we watched a 10-minute documentary that Nadja and Bruno made in the region so that we can open up for the debate. Our event is scheduled to run for another hour, and I would like to make sure that all of us will have an opportunity to ask questions. So if you will have any questions during the event, please ask them. And probably the best way with over 80 participants now would be simply to type them in the chat function. What's going on currently in the region is Panama being the narrowest point of passage between two Americas has essentially one highway, the Pan-American Highway that stops in southern part of the country. This is the jungle that we talked about, and this is the jungle that Bruno and Nadja crossed with migrants. A unique feature of Panamanian migration system is that the Panamanian authorities refer to it as quite managed system as opposed to other countries in the region. Migrants who enter from Colombia to Panama are received in one of the 3 reception centers set up by Panamanian migration authorities in the south of the country. They are screened there, their biometrics are taken. Part of the operation is done in collaboration with the US authorities who want to know who is coming towards the United States. They are housed there, even though housing has become a problem as the numbers of migrants have risen. And then from there, they are bused to the north of the country where they await admission to Costa Rica and proceed further north to destined for the United States and for Canada. This is a relatively regulated flow because Panamanian authorities only allow 100 migrants to pass through the country. However, what happened recently with COVID is that the system got stalled with the border closures. It is no longer to apply the smooth transition of migrants through Panama. So we are witnessing a humanitarian crisis whereby there is increasingly more migrants accumulating in the reception center in southern Panama who cannot proceed further north. This has created some tensions among migrants. First of all, because some of them have spent a number of years on the road. For example, Haitians who are transiting through the region up north, they are not coming directly from Haiti. Many of them have worked and lived in Brazil or Chile for some time in order to accumulate enough money to proceed further north. So for many migrants, the border closures create a shattered dream because they don't know if they will make it. The second challenge that probably Bruno and Nadja could tell us more about is the humanitarian situation and the lack of resources. Basically, Panamanian authorities were not prepared to receive as many migrants, stranded migrants, and the communities that we are talking about are themselves sometimes short of resources for themselves, including potable water. But as I said, picture is worth 1,000 of words. So Miguel, maybe let's show the wonderful video that Nadja and Bruno made, and then let's proceed with the discussion.
Life around the globe for refugees and migrants fleeing war, persecution, climate change, and economic misfortune routinely find themselves in great peril along migrant trails. Perhaps the most perilous path anywhere through the Darien Gap, a wild, lawless stretch that straddles Colombia and Panama. Last fall, before the pandemic and with the support of the Pulitzer Center, correspondent Nadja Drost and videographer Bruno Federico put themselves at great risk to bring us stories of people risking everything to make their ways north toward the U.S. And a warning, the images and accounts in this report may disturb some viewers.
Where South America meets Central America lies one of the world's wildest jungles. It's roadless, lawless, and almost entirely uninhabited. Its name, the Darien Gap. Underneath the soaring jungle canopy, migrants from around the world risk death crossing the jungle in a desperate bid to reach the US and Canada. They have no map and no instructions on how to make it through one of the world's most dangerous migration routes.
I would like to send a message to anyone who is thinking of doing this route. It's very dangerous. If I knew this, I wouldn't have done it.
Many migrants spend a week or even 2 on this trail before they reach a village and safety. But these journeys started long before. Migrants from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa flew into Ecuador or Brazil, where visa requirements are somewhat lax. Haitians also use this route as a springboard north. But to get from Colombia to Panama, they have to cross the Darien Gap by foot. It's the only missing 66-mile break in the Pan American Highway from the tip of Argentina up to Alaska. Migrants go first to the end of the road in Colombia, the port town of Necoclí, to head west along the Caribbean. The passenger manifest was global. Most had little idea of what lay ahead. They dock in Capurganá, a tourist town, now a trailhead for migrants headed into the Darien. We set out to join up with the migrant trail and reached a makeshift camp where smugglers wait for migrants. At dusk, a group of Cameroonians and Pakistanis arrived. They were exhausted and relieved to find the last spot on the trail where they can get hot food. Morning broke with torrential rain. The Darien is one of the wettest places on the planet. The environment could hardly be more different from the high mountains of Pakistan this group of friends call home.
The Taliban targeted our family from time to time. That is why I had to leave my country.
We packed our food for 5 days, and with guides we hired, followed the migrants as they set out, on a day-long ascent of a mountain ahead. The steep and slippery terrain was tough for everyone, but nearly impossible with an injury. This woman from Cameroon could barely put weight on her knee. Exhaustion took over.
God, the pain is too much. Yeah. The pain is more than me.
Up the mountain, the smuggler the Cameroonians and Pakistanis hired demanded payment. As we hiked, young men carrying square backpacks filled with bricks of cocaine passed us. We were told to expect their heavily armed security patrolling, so we put our camera away.
I'm full. My foot.
After a steep descent, the group made it to this river. They were almost out of food. Smugglers won't venture any farther into Panama, where they could face over a decade in prison if they're caught. This one, who didn't want his face shown, wished smugglers weren't prosecuted so they could help migrants safely complete their journey.
I've had to see mothers who tell their children they can't go on, to give themselves up to God. For anyone who has a family or kids, that breaks your heart.
Another smuggler, who can't be identified, told us he came across this migrant who had been injured and spent 2 weeks on this mountainside.
He was only crawling like a child. It's common. Most people who injure themselves die because there's no help for them.
From here on, migrants are on their own. The next morning, we came across George, a Cameroonian man. Injured, he had been left behind by his group. Then, forging ahead alone, he fell and dislocated his shoulder. Our guides popped it back into place. He was one of many Cameroonians on this trail who didn't want to be fully identified, fleeing a brutal conflict in his country.
You know, when you're running for your safety, you don't care what is happening to you. You don't care what is in front of you. You just want to have a safe ground.
Just like his group of friends had, we left him behind, hobbling onwards. The trail and riverbanks were littered with signs of desperation. Before long, a large group of Haitians and Sri Lankans appeared. Jean Delicat, a father of 2.
It's been 6 days that we're walking without stopping. The children cry of hunger. There's no food. There's nothing.
There was nothing else for them to do but try to go ahead. These Haitians had been living legally in Brazil or Chile. Among them were 6 children and 3 pregnant women. Dusk fell, and the Haitians made camp high above the river. It was hard to find wood dry enough to make a fire, and even harder to find food to cook. The night's catch, a few fish. Lying smugglers often tell migrants they're almost to their destination, which is why many, like Delicat, had already tossed their clothing and food.
The bread are finished right now. I have nothing here. Nothing.
Your Bible?
My Bible. Yes, my Bible. And my book. Where'd you go?
Dawn broke after a night of heavy rain. They've barely slept.
They are soaking wet and very hungry, but in fact, we are stuck here for now. That's because overnight the rain made the river rise dramatically.
It was too high to cross. The rivers often pull children from their parents' arms and sweep migrants to their death. Marooned, with unwelcome time to think, worries took over the Haitians, like Rosie Bantour.
Sometimes I think that if I was not this poor, I wouldn't have got into this situation.
The river level dropped, and we finally set out again. Later, we were joined by 15 Bangladeshi men with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. They had been robbed 4 times on the trail of everything. A man we're calling Saeed because he's scared to be identified explained.
A group of 5 to 7 mafias came to us. They pointed a gun towards us and took away our bags and everything. They left nothing for us. They even took away our food.
The river was dangerously high, and we cut the day short and set up camp. The next morning, 8 migrants from Haiti and Ghana, who began the crossing with the Haitians but fell behind, suddenly showed up. Among them, a woman and her boyfriend from Haiti, were robbed by bandits days earlier. One grabbed the boyfriend's arm, threatening to cut it with a machete. Charlie Pierre from Haiti helped tell us what happened.
After, the thief said, "Go off and leave the woman behind." And so he's walking, but looking behind, and sees these guys lowering his wife's underwear.
One of the men assaulted her, penetrating her intimate parts with his fingers, looking for dollar bills they suspect migrants of hiding. Later, we heard many stories of this and other abuse on the trail.
After another night of heavy rain, the river is very, very high. It's going to be risky to cross it, but we simply cannot wait any longer because we have run out of food.
Pierre found a pregnant Haitian woman he had been searching for, and we got on our way, trying to sidestep the river. After 8 days on the trail, Rosina Boateng's family from Ghana had run out of food.
Because when is it going to finish? The hope, I lost hope. I even lost hope.
Stomachs were empty, legs were quivering. Because the river was too high, we had to make a detour, winding up into the forest and dimming all hopes of reaching a settlement in Panama by night. The next day, minds were racing with one question: will we make it out of here? There were foreboding reminders of those who did not. But these migrants joined the legions of survivors crossing the Darien Gap. As the river opened up, a driver and his outboard canoe appeared. We were on our way, finally, to a village. This night, the group made its way out of the Darien Gap, but the rest of their journey is as opaque as the black waters ahead. From the Darien Gap in Panama, reporting with Bruno Federico, I'm Nadja Drost for the PBS NewsHour.
Just incredible reporting. And tomorrow, Nadia will report on the uneasy waiting game in Panama for the migrants who make it through the Darien Gap.
Thank you very much. As we just heard, this is just one of the 3 parts of the documentaries. We provided the links to the other parts in the advertisement. Let's turn to the authors of this report, Bruno and Nadia. Thank you very much for making it. It's an eye-opening and a very important report. Tell us, how did you come up with the idea of making this report?
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, for having us here. And the idea, well, at first I will apologize. Sometimes my English will be a bit weird, and but it is like that, and there is nothing to do. And the idea came because a strong attention that the migration topics take for us, migration is the last 20 or 25 years became a very strong topic because the policies that the state are implementing to prevent migrants to move from one place to other. This what we watched is not a natural disaster, is not an adventure, is a tragedy produced by policies. Those people will never do this path, this trail, because they will better have gone with an airplane directly on their destination. It will be cheaper, faster, safer. But policies about migrations prevent them. So this is the reason, because we really wanted to do that.
And I think that, we had been living in Colombia for about 10 years, and we had always, known that this route existed for years and years, but it was really just a trickle of people.
Some years, the estimates were that it was just a few hundred people that were going through the Darien. And, you'd sometimes come across local news reports about perhaps a boat of Somalis that had capsized in the Caribbean, or immigrants from Ethiopia being arrested in Bogota. Colombia is not a country that attracts migration, except for the Venezuelan migration that has been happening over the last several years. So it was just so unusual to be coming across these rather isolated stories at first about people from, all over the world who were using Colombia as a transit area. And we started noticing that the frequency of their travel really started picking up probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And sometimes there would, you would see cell phone videos, footage of literally hundreds of migrants stuck in the jungle that would, get out on WhatsApp groups and circulate perhaps through local media. So we decided that we wanted to take a look at this kind of growing phenomenon of migration through the Darien Gap to understand what migrants were going through to make this journey. And also, from not only a physical perspective, what they had to physically go through, but also what were the policies that they were coming up against that was impacting their journey. And so that's why we decided to expand our look and not just cover what they were going through in the Darien Gap, but then how they were basically butting up against the ripple effects of U.S. immigration, border enforcement as it moved southward. And the first place that happens is in Panama, which, Piotr, as you mentioned, through the security vetting that happens with biometric data and in very close collaboration with U.S. authorities. And we also met up with migrants once they had reached southern Mexico, where they came up to what they considered just as big of an obstacle as the border wall between the U.S. and Mexico, what they considered to basically be Trump's wall, but in southern Mexico, because it became impossible for them to move northward through Mexico. So we wanted to take a look at a little bit more of the journey than just the Darien Gap, but physically the Darien Gap portion of the journey is obviously the most dramatic.
Sure. That's very, very interesting. And at the same time that you were talking, one of the audience members asked, what about the sea? Can you tell us a little bit what's going on the seaside? I understand that going through the Darien Gap is still a bit easier or cheaper, or for some other reasons more doable option than transiting through the sea. Is this right? Is this what you?
Yeah. Yes, it's like the transit. There is the possibility to transit by sea, but it's far more expensive because because it's expensive to move a very fast motorboat through this area. This area is very strong, controlled by Coast Guard to prevent narco traffic, smuggling. So is just far more expensive, and so is used. Like there are people who go just by boat, but is far less frequent.
And also, we never saw any evidence of the smuggling route being able to avoid the Darien Gap entirely, and basically travel the entire Atlantic coast, so that migrants wouldn't have to go through the Darien Gap. What I think is more common is that there are smugglers who take migrants, in the nighttime, to cross the border into Panama, but then they literally dump them on a beach in the Darien Gap, and they still have to walk through the rest of it. And this, the frequency of that really depends on shifting internal policies. For example, Colombia over the past several years has really changed the way that it, some years it considers the transit of migrants illegal. Sometimes it gives them a permit to transit for 30 days. And so that also really impacts, do migrants have to do part of the journey illegally or not? And Bruno had tried to do a section of the journey.
1 year before, I tried to, I did another report for Univision, and I tried to do a section, and actually I did across with the motorboat with some migrants until exactly what Nadja said, until a point, a beach, and then from there, there were 3-4 days of walk. But this route closed after a capsize. The capsize put under a spotlight the collaboration or omissions by the Colombian authority to check this route, because there was a capsize. 9 migrants died in the capsize, and that was a national news in Colombia, and that make cut this route, because the question was how is possible that a motorboat full of migrants pass under the nose of the Coast Guard that is supposedly they really strongly control the area.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of policies, one of the audience members asked about your perception of what Panamanian authorities do. How do they handle this passage? In your next documentary, you are able to interview the representative of Panamanian migration authorities. What are your thoughts about what they are doing?
So, as you had mentioned, Piotr, Panama does conduct what they call the controlled flow of migrants. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the Panamanian government makes it illegal for people without a visa to cross into Panama. So that's the whole reason that migrants have to go through the Darien Gap, because they cannot enter legally. But once they are already in the country illegally, then Panama does facilitate their passage, basically. What we found in speaking with Panamanian authorities, including the chief of the border police, as well as the chief of the migration department, is that there is a real focus on trying to prevent migration from happening at all by persecuting the smugglers themselves. And there is also a discourse that we heard a lot about concern for the migrants' well-being, and that concern translating into trying to protect them by cutting out the smugglers from the equation. What we observed is that, whether you make migration legal or illegal, however dangerous you make it, migrants, when they're forced out of their countries and they're forced to flee, they're going to do whatever it takes to reach safer ground. And in most of the cases that we witnessed and heard about, the smugglers were not the evil human traffickers that authorities were describing them as, but they were actually a very important essential part of the survival of a lot of migrants in making this journey. And they're crucial in getting migrants to understand where they're going. Of course, not all of them are going to be helpful, and there absolutely are smugglers who take advantage of migrants, who abandon them, who take their money and run.
Lie to them. Yes.
Who lie to them all the time. But the fact that smugglers are not allowed to guide migrants on the Panamanian side of the border means that they all abandon migrants days before migrants reach a village in Panama. And that's when a lot of injuries happen, when a lot of them get lost, when they run out of food, and when a lot of them die. And so what we observed is that a lot of the framework with which Panamanian authorities were talking, when they talk about the well-being of migrants, it was focusing on trying to persecute human smugglers instead of making a route, which is going to happen, whether it's legal or illegal, instead of trying to make it safer. And what we observed is if, smugglers weren't as persecuted as they are, there'd probably be a very good chance of making the route safer because migrants would have a way to legally be accompanied by people who know the region. And they also wouldn't be I hate to use the word, but prey basically for armed bandits along the route who really take advantage of the vacuum of power, the vacuum of authority, and routinely assault, rape, and rob migrants along the trail.
This is a very interesting point because I feel that the same speech I found in a different countries, like in Europe, for example, or in Panama, in Mexico. There is a speech from conservative politicians and a speech from liberals one. The speech from conservative politicians is, we stop the invasion, we build a huge wall because the migrants are all terrible. And the liberal speech is, we want to save the migrants from the human traffickers. Speech is a play of word because the policies, at the end, the policies are normally the same. Like the policies of Europe, for example, about the route of the Mediterranean Sea is, I remember in my country, in Italy, I remember the word of a minister of interior, like say, we want to save the migrant from the human traffickers. But he did exactly the same, that the fall of politician was a far right-wing politician said that we want to stop the invasion. But what they did is imposed to the migrant to make a deadly route with rubber boat in the Mediterranean Sea. And that is exactly what happened in Panama. Like they say, but we want to save the migrant. No, they decide, because there was a route was easier, because the migrants can very easily cross, is like a few hours of walk crossing from Capurganá to Puerto Baldia, that is the first city in the Panama border. And then from there, the Panamanian authority could do the same things that they do now in Peñitas, that is the first reception center that they schedule that they examine them, they process them, and they send them from a different route. But the decision is evidently, like, even though we asked the precise question and was like the chief of the immigration was like, how you dare to tell us that we are imposing this route to the migrant? But it is like that. You have an alternative. You are imposing a deadly route to prevent the migrants or to do more costly, humanly, economically, the route for the migrant. This is a decision. That is a decision that is a worldwide decision.
Great. Yeah, that explains a lot. In fact, as you were talking, people asked about another governments in the region who are also involved in this route. So maybe just to answer those questions altogether, different countries in the region have different visa policies, and certain countries have had more lax or liberal policies than others. And it seems to me, unless I'm mistaken, that Panama does not have, as you mentioned, as easy legal entry policies as let's say, Ecuador or Brazil or Chile. So migrants had to arrive in those other countries south of Panamanian border. It was easier for them, let's say, to take a flight from somewhere, from Bangladesh or from Congo to countries such as Brazil or Ecuador. They would be able to enter, sometimes stay for a long time, whether legally and illegally. And what's important is for them ability to break the journey in half, earn some money, and then continue further north. And I think that this is the issue with many of the Haitians. Some of the Haitians that you probably met may have been the Haitians who left Haiti in as early as 2010 following the earthquake. They arrived in countries such as Brazil. They were staying there until they could save enough money to proceed further north, and many years after, they ended up on the road that you met them. So this is just to answer the question that someone had. And another question that I see here is about what did you notice about the perception of local communities? How did local communities receive those migrants? I understand that the numbers are growing, and maybe the perceptions have changed over years from one type of perception to another now, especially in the context of COVID. What did you notice?
For the migrants, for the local community is very okay. There are the local community in Capurganá, that is the last town in Colombia before the Darien Gap. And for example, there is a very poor town, even though is a touristic town because there is a wonderful sea and all that, but it's a very, very poor town. And the transit of migrants bring money to the community because they need to stay, they need to eat, they need to purchase stuff. And at that started like a way to help. Like I remember, like people the migrants arrive, they need a guide, and they need someone who help them to carry backpack stuff, and they hire the local community, and they hire the migrants have the money, have some money, so they hire. Oh, I will give you $10 if you accompany me for one day and you carry my backpack, something like that. And there was but this community is also a community that is in a very strategic place, that is very strongly impacted by narco traffic, because it's a route of cocaine. So that situation and the enforce of the border control make more difficult and reduce the trail, the path for the migrant, and that make that sometimes concede this path with narco trafficker path, and that create complex situations there, like that sometimes that help that can the smuggler gave, like the local people gave to the migrants sometimes need to get some agreement and some coordination with the narco trafficker, because the narco trafficker, they don't want that you bring 100 people to a route and you bring evidence and a spotlight to a route that they use for other stuff. On the other side, there is there are the indigenous community that are incredibly affected.
Yeah, I think that on the Panamanian side, the reception really varies, and I think that it depends on what the particular situation is. So I think the important thing to remember about this route is that it's very fluid. So the routes change all the time. And so sometimes different communities are impacted at different times. There have been communities that have found themselves being suddenly the receptor of hundreds and hundreds of Cuban migrants for 3 months at one point. And there's nowhere for them to stay. They're living in tents, they're defecating in the bush. There's no clean running water. And, the town began to feel quite hostile towards them because there's so few resources there in the first place for, the permanent inhabitants. The two settlements that we ended up walking to, we were quite surprised at how warmly receptive locals were of the migrants. And I think it's for two reasons. One is, these people live there. They are acutely aware of the dangers of walking through the region, and they come across people all the time who, when they stumble into town, they literally cannot walk anymore. Their feet are bleeding. They're often very, very sick. Many of them are injured. They haven't eaten for days. So I think that they can physically see the depth of suffering that people have gone through. But for some of these towns, it's been a little bit of an economic boom in the sense that when migrants are staying there, they end up buying food, water at local stores, and they end up staying in people's homes for a couple dollars a night. So it really helps to kind of boost the local economy. I think where there are tensions is where a lot of these communities, they're very remote indigenous communities that the Panamanian government hasn't given basic services like health clinics, clean running water in the best of times. And then when those resources are extra stressed, it's because sometimes of the influx of migrants that maybe a health clinic pops up or potable water comes in, but it's not because that town or settlement was originally deemed important enough to get basic services.
Yeah, that's a very important point because we may see official statements that certain organizations are provide certain services, but I think you give much more granularity to this picture, and we know that the situation may not be as rosy everywhere. And I wanted to ask you one question at the very beginning, and I didn't, but I see a couple people were very interested in it, so it's time to ask it. The question about the logistics, about the planning of this trip. Tell us a little bit about how you were able to prepare for this trip. What were the challenges that you faced? You were not exactly like one of the people from the group. Was it easy for you to gain acceptance? Was it easy for you to go with the first group you went, or maybe you were declined and had to wait? Tell us about the preparations and the kind of methodology of making this documentary.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, like the was a bit what was complex. I did short report 1 year before, and that teach me some lessons about what I mistake, what I did wrong, because I had a lot of problems the first time, and but what I needed to improve, and the key was to find trustworthy guides from the town, and that was thanks. We decided to join, to make in our crew like an incredible photographer and a friend of us, Carlos Villalon, that knew the Darien Gap and built a relation of trust with some family there, and so that was the key. That was the more essential key to do that. We hired some guide where some guides they were a family, and they accompany us to all the trip. They help a lot us, and that was the really game changer in our possibility to do the work. And there was a lot of problem to pass through the border because the migrants are allowed to pass, even though there are some checkpoint of the Senafron, that is the border police of Panama, but they let them pass through the jungle, not through the easy path. No, but of course they will not allow us to get through this path. So we needed to make a very complex deviation, and that cost us like a few days because they didn't want to let us go pass. Then luckily we met with the local community of indigenous who helped us a lot, Kuna indigenous, and they were like great, and they helped and they helped us to resolve the situation. And that was like the difficult to get in the path. Then like there were like technically was like very complex to keep the gear safe and dry, and we had like during the path every day was a gear less.
So we joined up. Basically, we joined up on the migrant trail at a migrant camp. It's just a campsite, and it's the last place that migrants are kind of able to get a warm meal up on a mountaintop. And it's usually where migrants arrive on their second day walking. And so we were able to do the rest of the trip with migrants. And to get to your question, Piotr, kind of how did we approach them, and did we get rejected by some? Our goal was to try to walk as much as we could with a variety of groups. And so we spent, a day and a night with a group of Cameroonian and Pakistanis, and they wanted to keep on walking at night. Our guide said, there's no way we're doing that. So we let them, continue on, and we stayed put. And the frequency was such that, we didn't have to wait more than half a day probably until another group came. And that was a very large group of Haitians. And as we were walking, over the days, our group kept on growing. Because migrants, when they come across each other, they do like to try to often kind of group up for safety. So for example, several days in, a group of 15 Bangladeshi men literally appeared out of the forest, wearing absolutely nothing. All of their tents, their clothing, their money, their food had been robbed. They'd been robbed several times by bandits. And so, when you think about how vulnerable migrants are in this situation, they're carrying everything in their life on their back. The only people that they come across in the jungle until they get to a village are other migrants or armed bandits. So they saw us, I think, as a potential boost to their safety because of numbers. And they also saw that, we had guides who were sticking with us long after smugglers, end their transaction with migrants, and our guides knew where they were going. So I think that the concern for migrants to talk to us or to appear on camera usually had to do with the kinds of situations they were escaping, particularly people from Bangladesh and from Cameroon. Some of them were very nervous about appearing on camera. And so that's something that we, had to discuss individually with each person. Do they want to speak but have their face disguised? Do they not want to appear at all? And so that made filming, for Bruno, who was behind the camera, a real challenge to know, to keep straight who wanted to participate and who didn't. We also spent, we were very conscious of the fact that we were encountering migrants at basically their most vulnerable, in the most dangerous section of their journey. And so we tried to spend just normal time with them, talking, walking alongside them, not necessarily taking out the camera, try to establish trust. That happens pretty quickly, though, when you're in such a dramatic situation where you're camping out with each other every night, where you're climbing up and down, mountains and crossing rivers.
Covered in mud.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a very quick bonding experience. And our pitch to them basically was that we wanted to be able to show a wider public what they had to go through in order to reach their destination. And I think that a lot of them appreciated having their stories shown, and basically the suffering and also the courage that they had in facing these situations. There were many who didn't want to participate or wanted to participate with their identities being disguised. So it was a constant kind of discussion among them.
Yes. This brings me to a question of ethics doing this type of research. And I understand that you may have been perceived as someone who has more resources than migrants, that migrants were in a situation where they had to negotiate with the guides the price of passage. And I don't know to what extent were there very hard negotiations or migrants just went along. But of course, people had different resources there. How did you deal with perhaps perception that someone doesn't have the money, needs to make it? Maybe they have a crying children or is pregnant. And here are these two kind of outsiders who may have more resources. Have you ever been directly or indirectly asked for support? And how did you deal with this?
Okay, from the point we met the migrants were leaving their guides. So there were no guides from this point until the first little village
for another day. But they had paid. They had paid their guides.
Yeah. So normally they hire guides for 1 or 2 days, and then they have these 5 days, at least 5/10 days, depending on the luck and the speed, that they need to do. They need to go without any guides. So they just join us, because they feel, they felt more comfortable, because they knew that we seemed to them, we seem to have a well-organized trip. That doesn't mean that we have comfortable, we have amok, just, but the guide were very, they knew a lot how to move. So they joined us, and they didn't need, of course, to deal with to pay our guide. Just we merge our path. They were and there was and we were always very clear in our speech that okay, they can. That we they are not obliged to be filmed. And that was good because someone stayed with us for all the time, and we didn't have one only image from them because I don't want to be filmed. So they felt comfortable to be able to refuse the camera, but to stick around. And it's not it's a pattern. You stay around perhaps half hour before or half hour behind, And there was.
I think that, you asked Piotr, was there a situation where they asked for some kind of help? And people did end up asking us for food, for example. And, this trip was definitely, I think, a huge challenge in terms of, I would say that the kind of ethical decisions that we had to face on a daily basis were far more challenging than the physical challenges of doing the trip, because as journalists, we were cognizant that we can't. Our principal objective and obligation is to bear witness, and we need to do that in such a way that doesn't intervene with the story. That being said, we were coming across people who were very badly injured, people who hadn't eaten food in days, pregnant women and children, and there was no relief for days. So this was a very different reporting situation. I mean, we've reported a lot on other migrant populations or refugee populations where people are in very desperate situations, but there often is some kind of infrastructure, whether it be a refugee camp, for example, set up to help them. And this was a situation where it was actually life or death for a lot of people with no relief available. And so we tried to approach a lot of these situations with a combination of basically trying to maintain our journalistic integrity with humanity. I think that together we discussed, and also with the photographer who is accompanying us, that I don't think that we would have felt comfortable as human beings. Us having food, walking for days with a group of people that was expanding sometimes day by day. Like it started, with 20 people and it grew to over 35 people, to have them watch us eat food. They haven't eaten in days. They're in a far worse situation than us. And to reject food, it kind of became clear, we're journalists, but we're also human. We're also human beings.
We decided to share our food, and and we felt very comfortable with the decision. That wasn't I feel that there was no doubt from us that was the right decision. And of course, that was a very complicated decision because our crew, between the guides, us and our friend and mate photographer, we were 8 people, and we bring the food for 8 people, and the migrants were 30, 50 migrants that we met on the path. And of course, that mean to go to rationalize the food, and we share with the kids, we share with the pregnant woman. We decided because there was kind of an understanding amongst the whole group that the kids were the priority. Yes, the kids were, and that means that the last 2 days we ran out of food ourselves. And I think that the whole reason that journalists don't give gifts, for example, to people who they interview, is so that people don't, your interview subjects don't feel like they
they're going to say what you think you want to hear, or feel obliged to you. And so I think that what we tried to do is really emphasize all the time that, just because we were sharing an experience and walking together and sleeping together and eating together, that didn't translate into an obligation on their part to be interviewed or appear in the documentary. And I think that was understood just, by the sheer reality that a lot of them, said, yeah, I don't want to be interviewed, or I don't want to be identified, or I don't want to speak about, X subject. Mm-hmm. So it was a constant balancing act.
One of the questions that I see here popped out, perhaps it's a question more to me than to you, because you did the hard work and I did the easy work of sitting in front of computer and checking statistics. Someone asked about the statistics. No, there aren't really good statistics on what we are talking about, just because of the illicit nature of the movement. However, Panamanian authorities do publish the number of migrants who cross through this border, and just a basic picture from the statistics is that the number of registered migrants crossing through this border has increased by 16 times from 2010 to 2020, from around 500 at the very beginning. There was a peak in the flows in 2016 or 2018, when there were 30,000 people registered. And then, of course, the numbers declined. They declined with COVID and with the border closures, but they didn't stop. So what COVID did, at least looking at the statistics, is that there is still mobility through the area. Last year, there were around 6,000, maybe 500 registered. This year, only in January, around 1,000 migrants were registered who have crossed this border. So this brings us to another question of the impacts of COVID, and actually what happened since you made this documentary. You followed up with migrants. You were able to keep in touch with them directly or indirectly, and you had a very fascinating encounter with one of them when you didn't expect it. Tell us a little bit more about what happened after you finished filming.
Okay, so I'll just quickly try to, and you can maybe talk about Rupun, but basically, the migrants who we followed, we caught up with a lot of them in southern Mexico. And that's where, as I mentioned, they really came up against what many considered the southern version of Trump's wall. And so Mexican authorities had started collaborating so much under US pressure to prevent migrants from traveling to the US-Mexico border that it literally became impossible to get through checkpoints and make their way north. And the only way that migrants found was via smugglers. And I think that, a lot of people are really aware of some of the dangers of getting smuggled through Mexico. And in fact, when we were in southern Mexico, a lot of the people a lot of the Cameroonians who we were following, they, some of them just missed by one boatload a departure of a boat that capsized, where a total of four migrants died on the Pacific side of Mexico. So again, we see this narrative happening over and over again. The more that you push migrants into taking the illegal routes, the dangers increase. When most of the migrants who we followed through Mexico, at that time, Mexican authorities were detaining them often for weeks or months, and then releasing them. They did end up making their way to the U.S.-Mexico border. And at that time, Trump had basically made what's been called the asylum ban. So he's restricted the eligibility criteria for asylum so much that it's made it almost impossible for most people to claim asylum. And so what most of the people who we were following, they were only able to claim lesser protections that would prevent them from getting deported, but that wouldn't give them nearly the full protections of asylum. Everybody who we followed ended up, presenting themselves legally at the border and were detained in ICE facilities for, I think the least amount of time was 3 months, but some were detained up to 7 or 8 months. And some of them were released by having to pay bonds of $10,000, $15,000. And since many of them have been released, because of the time period that they entered the US, that asylum ban has been reversed. And now some of them who have lawyers are able to apply for asylum. They're having to wait a year for their work permits. So we're in touch with Cameroonians, Pakistanis, and Haitians who are currently, out of ICE. They're living with either family or friends. Most of them are waiting for work permits and have no way to subsist. A few of them have started to work with work permits. And we also tried to keep track of a few of them who were deported. So ICE, especially through the fall, and continuing into this year, 2021, under Biden, despite his promise to not deport people for the first 100 days of his presidency, there has been an enormous number of deportations that have been happening. I think what's of most concern is, where the lack of due process in sending people back. So, most people have no legal representation. Even if they do, they haven't been able to go through the normal legal proceedings to make their case. And the countries that these people are getting sent back to are countries like Cameroon, where there are several internal armed conflicts going on, Congo, Haiti, where there's incredible political unrest, and a country with less than 10 ventilators during a pandemic. So we have been in touch with a Haitian who contacted Bruno to let him know that he had been deported to Haiti. He had been one of these Haitians that you mentioned, Piotr, who had been living in Chile for years before with his family. One of his children was born in ICE detention, and that family is going to try to make their way back to Chile because they simply can't survive in Haiti. We were in touch with a Cameroonian until he was deported to Cameroon, and we have no idea what's happened to him. None of his friends also have managed to be in contact with him. And that's of great concern because we do know that a lot of people who've been deported to Cameroon have been detained and tortured by the army. But we have an uplifting story. Do you want to talk?
Yeah, let's. This probably will be our last piece because we're running out of time. But I think it's very important to mention the uplifting story. Bruno, would you like?
Yeah, that there is we met actually Nadja. You should tell.
Well, I'll just tell the beginning of it because I was the first one of us to be home. But so we live in Brooklyn, New York, and our doorbell rang. and we weren't expecting anybody. I was home alone, and so I opened the window to see who it was, and it was a delivery man delivering food, obviously for our neighbors below. And so I told him that he rang the wrong doorbell and to walk downstairs. And he kind of did a double take at me, and he recognized me. Unbelievably, he was one of the 15 Bangladeshi men that we met in the Darien Gap, who had been robbed of absolutely everything. And over a year later, he happened to be, and mistakenly, at our doorstep here in Brooklyn. So we did a little follow-up piece for PBS, if people want to watch it, that just goes into his journey a little bit more. And there was a real kind of public outpouring of interest in his story. And people on Twitter got together a GoFundMe campaign, and within 24 hours raised about $6,000 to help him as he settles into New York. So just a incredible chance encounter. And he told us that most of his group of the 15 who were in the Darien Gap are in fact here in New York City. And one had been deported to Bangladesh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just the beginning of a very, very very long story, and we could go in different directions from there. But I think it's important to end by just giving the audience a little bit more information. Where can they learn more about this work and about any other work that you would like to share with the audience? If someone would like to learn more work.
Well, I think in terms of our reporting, it's all kind of consolidated on the Pulitzer Center website. So the Pulitzer Center sponsored the 3-part series for the PBS NewsHour, as well as a magazine story in the California Sunday magazine that focused particularly on the journey of the Cameroonian and Pakistani group. And that's all. If you just want to Google Pulitzer Center, extracontinental migration, you'll find it. There are a lot of immigration reporters who are reporting on current changes in immigration policy that will impact in particular Black migrants who have tended to, in the last year, really taken the brunt of these deportation flights. And there's a lot of changes going on right now with the new administration. There's battles over the deportation orders and a court order that, basically banned the 100-day ban on deportation flights. So I think that a good way is just to keep up with immigration reporters who are looking into the discussions underway on which policy changes are what's being considered.
Yeah, there is an incredible series that I watched that I really loved. That I think that by the point of view of the documentary and by the point of view of the information and journalistic is great. That is Immigration Nation. Is a Netflix series that I really recommend about policies, about how the role of ICE changed the way people is living in these countries, America, is to keep millions of people under terror regime that their life can change from one day to another. Is a very good documentary that I would like to suggest.
Great, thank you. Well, you have received many bravos on the chat line, and I would like to add my own. Thank you very much for your time. It's been really, really incredible to watch your work, read your work, and hear your work, see you here live. And I would encourage everyone to check out the Pulitzer Center, where there is more information about you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you to you.
It's been a pleasure to discuss with everybody, and thanks for the interest.